this on my computer. I don't know if you've all had a chance yet, but we are now trying to remember to record and also post them on our website on the calendar page and the Zoom page. We have lists and links to our videos. So I'm Beth Billings. This is Around the Table Yarns, and we are doing stranded color work today, which is a knitting in color technique. So stripes are one way that we knit in color, and we've had a class on intarsia previously, although we don't have a recording of that. And stranded color work is the way that we're going to talk about it today. And I just want to show my reference book is The Essential Guide to Color Knitting Techniques by Margaret Radcliffe. I'm a big fan of Margaret Radcliffe. Her book, The Knowledgeable Knitter, I find invaluable in giving information about all kinds of knitting knitting techniques, and also advising like ways of planning to avoid problems in your knitting, and also how to get out of trouble with problems in your knitting. So she wrote The Essential Guide to Color Knitting Techniques. I researched a number of different books, including a new one called the Color Knitting Bible. And I found that the Color Knitting Bible was essentially the same information that is in this book, but not as in detailed, and maybe not as confident, I felt like. That was my opinion. Maybe other areas of color knitting techniques in the Color Knitting Bible feel more confident to me, but I really felt like Margaret Radcliffe has her finger on the pulse. So this is the book that I'm using, and I recommend it for purchase. And I want to start with why is it called stranded color work? And you have a sample of my knitting here. I'll make sure I'm not coming through the middle of it. I've started I'm working in the round, and I've started to do some stranded color work. And what is noticeable is that on the back, the yarn that is not in use is stranded or floated across the stitches where you're using the other color. So typically with stranded color work, you're using 2 colors at a time. But as you can see in my piece here, I've changed colors. So you can use multiple colors, but there are only 2 colors in the row in use at a time. And it is traditionally in place with small patterns. And so here is a piece of paper with some very typical stranded color work kinds of patterns. They can get bigger, they can have more involved things, but it is not unusual for stranded color work to only have 3 or 4 stitches before you change back to the next color. And that is probably the best place to start with this kind of color work, because it really gives you a feel for changing colors as you work across the row. It creates a very thick fabric. So I have a sweater that I made here in stranded color work, and it is it's already in a worsted weight, or it isn't a worsted weight fabric. So it's a pretty thick knit already. And on the inside, you can see the stranding behind creates another layer of fabric behind the single layer, behind what we normally think of in our knits as the single layer of fabric. So it is a very warm fabric, and that's a lot of the reason why stranded color work is so widely used in yokes, which is how this sweater is constructed, with a yoke around the neck, because that would create more warmth and more comfort around your shoulders and your neck. And also why many times the hem or the cuffs would be stranded, because again, it's more warmth, more fabric around your hands, around your waist, keeping the cold from getting in. and around your neck, keeping the cold from getting in. So a lot of the Norwegian sweaters or the Icelandic sweaters are patterned in stranded color work around the neck. And it was, not only is it pretty and it creates an interesting fabric, but it's also creating more warmth and a thicker fabric in the places where you want to keep out the cold. The drawback, though, is that stranding creates a less elastic fabric. So if I pull across my strands, if they're not loose enough, it's not anywhere near as elastic as if I pull across my just plain knitted fabric. This is very elastic, whereas this part of it may stick a little bit because the strands aren't as loose as knitting that is done with just one strand. So you have to make a little bit more of an effort to create more elastic fabric. So you can see here, if I pull across here, it doesn't stretch out nearly as much as if I pull across the area where there's no stranding. And so you have to work a little bit harder to create elasticity in your stranded color work. Another feature of stranded color work is that it is typically represented on charts. So if you're doing a stranded color work pattern, it's good if you can read a chart. And so I'm just going to briefly go over chart reading for color work so that you are not uncomfortable with it. Here is a stranded color work chart. I'm going to try and zoom in a little bit on it. All right, we're going to look at the bottom of it and let's see if I can improve the focus. 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 There's my focus. Oh. Doesn't seem to want to focus too well. Let's see if I can go closer and get a better. Well, let's start down here. There, I can see the numbers now. Can you all read the numbers?
Yeah.
Because stranded color work is typically done in the round, the numbers will always show up on the right-hand side of your chart. So, and they are numbered from the bottom to the top because it represents the knitting as it is being worked, as it is being viewed from the right side or the public side of the knitting. In other words, if you were looking at the hat that this pattern is for, this would be the first row of patterning, of color patterning in the hat. And you would be reading it from right to left, just like you would be knitting on the right side, on the public side, from right to left. And then you would go to the next row and read that from right to left. So the first stitch here would be the first stitch after the beginning of the round. Now, this is not nearly enough stitches to complete a hat. So this would represent one repeat of the pattern. And sometimes that repeat might be, there might be additional stitches on the other side of your repeat if you're looking at a chart. So I just want to say that this is not considered all of the stitches that you would need. You would continue, you would go to the end of these and then you would start back at the first stitch and repeat it until you got to the end of the round. Kate, I see you have a question.
Yes. So does round just mean that it's kind of like a continual, it isn't a back and forth, it's a...
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
just to show you, trying to pick it up without, this is a piece of, oh, hello, you can't see that. This is a piece of work that is being done in the round. So the whole thing is in a circle. So that is extremely common for stranded color work. And the reason is that you can see the work on the front of the fabric. And it's very easy to see it on the public side or the right side of the fabric. On the inside of the fabric, on the wrong side of the fabric, what you see are the floats. And so it's much more difficult to read the stitches from this side because the floats obscure what you have already done. And so the only things that you can see clearly are the stitches that are on your needle. So if you turn and work back on the purl side, you are looking at really only the stitches that are on your needle clearly. You'd almost have to like keep checking the front of the work to know exactly where you are in the pattern. Whereas if you're working from the front side of the fabric, you can not only see the ones that are on the needle, but you can also see all of the rows that you have done already. And so that helps you keep your place in a chart or in a pattern repeat. It's usually, these are very memorizable patterns. And so, for example, you can see that the row that I just completed was 3 of the dark color, 3 of the light color, 3 of the dark color, 3 of the light color, and it was just that all the way around. All of these rows are kind of like that. So, so it's very easy to memorize them, and it's very easy to make sure that you're centered. So like, for example, this point here centers on the center stitch of the 3 above. This point at the top is centered on this center stitch of the light color that's the row above it. So it's very easy to see that you're in pattern, that you haven't gotten off by a stitch one way or the other, that you haven't dropped a stitch or added a stitch or made a mistake in your pattern somewhere if you are working in the round from the front. But if you're working in the round from the back, you can really lose your place. And I say that from personal experience because I have worked stranded color work back and forth, and it's really, I found it really confusing and difficult. Great question. So again, this is a chart, and I want to point out in the chart the things that are very helpful. The first thing that's very helpful is that all charts have a stitch key. And so it tells you if it is a blank square, it's knit. If it has this symbol, which looks like a nose, it's a slip 2 together, knit 1 past the 2 slip stitches over. And so that is a double decrease, and it's happening here. And so when you see a double decrease, that means some of the stitches are disappearing. When they disappear, they will become completely blank spaces. So they're not even circled around with an outline. And so when the stitches disappear in your chart, you ignore them. In other words, when you finish this round, so you would be working from the beginning of the round here, so you would knit 2 in the lighter color, you would knit 2 in the darker color, you would knit 5 in the lighter color, knit 2 in the darker color, knit 2 in the lighter color, and then do the centered double decrease here. And then when you get to the next section, you would just start with the 2 again. So you would just skip over the absent stitches. So that's for any chart. If things are being added or decreased out of your pattern, then you may have these lines of stitches that are no longer there or that appear after you do an increase later on. And so those stitches are just not going to be in the chart. And so you pass over any absent stitches and only work the chart stitches that are present. So the stitch key is very important. And then for color work, obviously the color key is important. And so the color key is right here, and it tells you which color is corresponding to which color in the chart that they're using. So chart reading really simplifies what you're doing, because you can look down and see exactly what the knitting is supposed to look like, what the pattern is supposed to look like, and how these red stitches line up in the pattern, and that it lines up in the center of the pattern. So using a chart can be a very easy way. If all of this was written out and it said knit 3 light color, knit 1 dark color, repeat, then when it comes to the next row where it says knit 1 dark color, knit 5 light color, knit 3 dark color, knit 5, and then repeat, you wouldn't know where this color corresponds to the knit 5 dark or knit 5 light in the next round. But you can see it so easily. So I know that people avoid charts, and I can't put in enough plugs for learning to be comfortable with charts. Just memorizing whatever is in the key, or if you can't memorize it, write it where you're working. You know, write it here. If having it up here is too far away, then pencil it in along the side of your chart, or pencil it in where you see the figure that the key is referring to, because charts can make your life a lot easier. And the final thing I want to say about characteristics of stranded color work is that it can be done in any yarn. So you could do it in cotton, you could do it in rayon, you could do it in wool, you could do it in mohair, you could do it in anything. But the stickier your yarn is, in other words, the more fiber is visible sort of at the close-up level for your yarn, the more sticky it is, the easier it is to work the floats and to work the stranded color work. I'm gonna just back this up a little bit again and go back out. Okay, so this is the chart that I'm using, and it's actually, it's somebody drew it onto a piece of graph paper, and they took it from a child's scarf in the Shetland Islands Museum. And so it's just a representation of an actual Shetland Island color work piece. And it's very simple patterns. Here you can see it's just a square of 4 stitches alternating in dark and light, and then switching off kind of like a checkerboard. And then there's some rows of plain knitting, and then the zigzag, and then rows of plain knitting, and then these half moon kind of shapes. So I really love how these patterns come out in color knitting and stranded knitting. And here's an example. Here on the bottom are my squares, and I did those in this hot pink color. And this is the beginning of my round. So you can see there's a little bit, maybe a little bit of distortion right at the beginning of the round. And then I worked the 4 rows in between, and then I started with a different pair of colors. So I changed colors and I started with a different pair of colors. Some Fair Isle work. Fair Isle is an island in the Shetlands where stranded color work really took off in the, we think in the 1600s, I believe. It's been over several hundred years. And they are known for using very sticky Shetland wool. And they also, the men of the Shetland Islands are great sailors, and they went all over the world. And so it is believed that somebody brought home color work from somewhere else, maybe woven color work, and the women of the Shetland Islands copied it in their knitting. And that's where stranded color work came from in the Shetlands. Fair Isle knitting has become the equivalent term to stranded color work, but it's done in Turkey, it's done in Scandinavia, it's done in Peru and all over South America. So you can't say that it only came from the Shetland Islands, but Fair Isle knitting is a word that is often used as a synonym for stranded color work. Okay, so let's talk about some techniques for stranded color work. The first thing is, how do you deal with 2 balls of yarn in the same row? What do you do to make that work? Well, everybody knits a little bit differently, and everybody holds and tensions their yarn a little bit differently. So the first thing is to know how you hold and tension your yarn. Does anybody here hold it on their left and is a continental knitter? Or is everybody here an English style knitter and hold it on your right?
I switch back and forth depending on if I have to purl a lot.
So what do you do if you have to purl?
If I have to purl more often, then I will tend to kind of have it in my right, because purling with the yarn in my left hand just is way more involved. But yeah, I go back and forth.
Okay.
If it's a lot of stockinette, I tend to use my left hand.
Okay, a lot of knit stitches?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Anybody else? How you knit? Do you hold the yarn on the left or the right?
When I knit, I hold it on the right. But when I did do tricolor work before, I did kind of, in the pattern, I would do my left finger and my right finger with the yarn.
Your left finger and your right finger with the yarn. Okay, so that is definitely a technique that is recommended or cited often as being the best practice. And I just want to demonstrate what that looks like. So I have to tension my yarn around my pinky because I'm not a dominant, I don't usually hold it in my left hand, so I need a little bit more control of it. I have much better control with my right hand. And I'm starting this row of my chart, I believe. So I'm just doing, the foreground is my purple. So I'm doing 2 purple, 1 lighter color, 2 purple, 1 light, all the way across. And I'm starting here at the beginning. And again, I can check my chart. I don't even really need to know what the beginning of the round is. I can just see, okay, I'm starting mine. This is my beginning of the round. And so that's a dark color on top and then the light. So I'm going to knit, I'm going to push my yarn in place, and I'm going to knit with my left hand and then move it and then knit with my right hand and then move it and then knit with my left hand. And then I'm going to keep going in pattern. So it's 2 dark, 1 light, 2 dark, 1 light. And you can see that I'm in pattern. There's my 1, it's right, it's centered right where it's supposed to be. And then I would just continue like that around the row. And then 1. So that's how I'm holding it. So I'm tensioning it more carefully on the left because I don't normally hold it on the left. I'm holding it as I normally do on the right. I could also hold it with both yarns on the right-hand side, in which case I might choose to not carry them for every stitch. I might just have them held in my palm, and then I would go under the purple and then under the light, under the purple, under the light, under the purple, and then pick up the light. And I could probably be very quick that way because I'm a dominant right-hand knitter. You can also do the same thing, moving the yarns over to your left hand, and you can hold both of them. And again, I have to be careful with my tensioning, but holding both of them over different fingers on the left-hand side. So I'm not very good at this. I'm very awkward holding things on my left, which is why I do not teach continental knitting. Okay, so I've got my 2, and I'm going to go under, I'm going to pick up the light strand and off, and then the dark strand. Awkward. So this would be better demonstrated by somebody who's a much better continental knitter than myself, because that is the epitome of awkward. So is it better then to hold them in both hands, which is cited as the best practice? The answer is no, not if you can control your tension well by holding it in your dominant hand. So if you find that you're more comfortable holding it on the left because you can tension it more evenly on the left, please go ahead and hold it in the left hand. If you're more comfortable holding both in your right hand and dropping the strands, and I think Liz actually experienced that when she was working on a stranded piece. Again, you can hold them in the palm of your right hand, for example, and then wrap as you need to, or pick up as you need to the yarn that you're knitting. And if you're able to maintain good tension by holding them separately, then that is also a good way to do it. And that can help. So the other reason that people talk about this is because they're concerned about whether or not the yarns will get tangled. And the trick is actually keep your yarns apart and knit them in the same order throughout. In other words, I'm not twisting my yarns around each other. So I'm going to knit with the lighter color here, and it came from above because it's on the right hand side. And then I'm going to knit with my lighter color, and it's coming from below because it's on the left hand side. And as long as I do that, I'm not going to tangle my yarns. But if I were to put them on the same side and pick them up always from here and wrap, you see what I'm doing? I'm dropping them and wrapping them. And I'm going to drop that and pick up from below and do the other color. Then they really will get tangled up and they will get twisted around each other. So you want to keep them on one side or the other. And it actually makes a difference which yarn you choose to be on the left or the right. So I want you to look at my patterning here. Although I am doing, and you can see here, even inside of this line, you could look at this the white spaces here as the pattern, or you can look at the black spaces as the pattern. And I'm looking at the black spaces as the design element and the white ones as the background element. Okay, so some patterns, you can't see it as clearly, but if you pick one, the white spaces or the black spaces, to be the design element that is in the more important element, or the one that you want in the foreground of your knitting, that's the one that you want to have on the left-hand side as you work it. So in my case, that is the brighter colors. Oh, look, a birthday candle. That is the brighter color. My brighter colors I'm holding on the left. And my light background color I'm holding on my right. And the reason for that is when you bring the yarn from below, it actually travels further and there's more yarn visible. And so it becomes the more prominent color in a piece of work. And I can show you an example of that in the book. Oh. Right. Here. So this is the lighter color prominent. So the lighter color on the left, and this is the darker color on the left. And those two, the difference between those two is an example of why you want one color to be held in one hand and always held in the same hand. Because you don't want to mix these two effects in your knitting when you're doing stranded knitting. Up here, she's talking about holding the two yarns at even tension. So at the top of her swatch, the lighter color was held lower, so it was held in front, but they were tensioned in a different way to make them come out equally. So you're kind of going for this ideally. But if you're going to pick one, you want the foreground knitting to be the one that's more dominant. So you want to hold your foreground color to the left. Okay. Kate asked, if I was knitting this in the round, and we've already said that we're doing stranded color work in the round primarily, but I'm sure many of you have seen stranded color work cardigans, and also arm openings and neck openings can't be done in the round, but they can actually. What happens is, to create an opening in your fabric, you would do what's called a steek. So let's say I wanted to create an opening between these two stitches. I would just do a looped cast on right where I wanted it of 9 stitches, or up to 9 stitches. And I would just do backwards loops, alternating my 2 colors like that. So I'm just doing a backwards loop, alternating the 2 colors, and I would do it so that there were 9, so that it was an odd number. There would be a center stitch, and that would be where you would cut the steek open. And then there would be 4 stitches on either side that would be the space that would allow you to cut it open and not have it just unravel. So I think I've put 2, 4, 6, 8. So we'd have 1 more. So our center stitch in this case would be a light color. When you work a steek, you could put markers on either side of it. When you work a steek in stranded color work, you'd maybe want to mark it on either side. You would work your increases or decreases for the neck outside of the 9 stitches. So let's say this was the beginning of a V-neck shaping for my neck. I would leave 1 stitch for a selvage, and I would work my decreases for the neck angling off like this before I reached the steek. And then I would have a selvage stitch, and I would do the other ones on the decreasing on the other side of it. The steek would stay the same. I would work the steek either in the same colors. So I would work the light, the dark, the light, the dark, or I would alternate so that the stitches are combined in a checkerboard or in vertical stripes. Either way is good. You can do patterns in your steek if you choose to, but generally speaking, you want to work equal amounts of both colors across the steek as you're working it. And then what happens is that area is available to be cut to open up a neck or an armhole or the front of a cardigan. If it's for the front of a cardigan, you'd actually cast on the steek at the same time as the other stitches. The steek stitches are not counted as part of your total pattern. So they would not, so if you needed 154 stitches around, then you would need 9 more for your steek, for example. Okay, so we've talked about how to open up spaces. I'm going to just take these off for now because I'm going to talk about tension. So that's the technique that we use for creating openings in circular knit stranded color work. I'm going to untangle my yarns here. Yep, they were untangled. Okay. So some people have trouble with stranded color work, and they find that their colors seem to bubble in the work because they're stranding the yarns too tight. So I would say the first thing is to practice. Practice until you're comfortable with your stranding, and find out whether you're really comfortable doing it in 2 hands or if you really want to do it with your dominant hand for knitting. So that would be the most important thing, is to practice. The second thing, and this has been a discussion in the shop because we've been talking a lot about the length of circular needles. So this is a circular needle that is about 6 inches long. And a 5 or 6 inch circular needle gives you a lot of rigid space on the needle before it becomes the flexible part of the cord. And the reason that that can be helpful for stranded color work is that if you are having trouble with your work bubbling or being too tight, that your floats aren't long enough, what you want to do is actually every time you change color, so I'm about to knit with the lighter color, you want to spread out down the right needle, your stitches. Spread them away from the tip of the right needle so that the color is traveling as far as it can from the stitch it was last used on up to the next stitch where it's going to be worked. And then make sure you work that right on the tip of the needle and off. And then spread it again when you're going to be doing the next color. And then spread and do the next one. Now that's much more of an issue when you have long sections of colors of the same color. For example, where I was reading, they pretty much think that 9 stitches of the same color is the longest float that you really want to have in your pattern. If you have more than 9 stitches across, you could consider duplicate stitching that one stitch in the middle so you don't have a strand of a really long float in your work. So that would be a possible option. But using the longer length needle, whether it's a double pointed needle of longer length, like 8 inches instead of 6 inches or 6 inches instead of 5 inches, or having a longer circular needle, that can help your tensioning in circular knitting with floats. The other thing that you can do is you can work your tube inside out. And that sounds crazy, but it actually works. So if I just turn my work inside out like that, so now my floats are on the outside of the work. They're traveling a slightly longer distance. And now I have to pull my, so you turn it inside out, you pull your yarns through to the center and place them in the same orientation. So I want my purple on the left and my gray on the right. But you're still facing the work the same way, but now your stranded color work is working from the outside of the pattern. This would be especially important for like socks that might be done in stranded color work. So you're still holding your yarn in the same way, but it's now on the outside.
Oh, that's so cool.
So this is a really helpful technique for maintaining better tension with your stranded color work. So those are the 3 tips that I have for you for increasing or decreasing the amount of strain on your floats. And the last thing I want to say is that if you have a long float across the back of your work, instead of having to secure it in the row that you're in, consider securing it in the next row. So for example, let's say I had this one was a long, this is a fairly long float for my piece. So when I get to the center of that float, and I would know that by looking at my chart. So let's say there wasn't a dot in the middle and I just had 5 here. When I got to this center dot of the next round, I could put my needle down and catch the float. So I would go into the stitch that I'm going into and then down the back to catch the float, make my stitch, not bringing the float through, but just catching it on the back and then continuing. Again, maintaining your loose tensioning as you go. So I found that to be a really nice trick for working your floats, if you don't want to always be worrying about, okay, did I catch my float? Is my float too long? You just work your floats, make them as long as you want them, and then in the next round, you could circle the places where the float could be caught on your pattern and just work underneath the float in the next round. All right, we talked a little bit about shaping on the outside of our steeks, but I want to talk a little bit about shaping in color work. And we've all talked a lot about whether or not stitches, or whether or not our increases or decreases are turned in a certain way. But I want to just bring that into the realm of working in two colors. So when you're working in the same color and you do a knit two together, I'm going to go back one. If you do a knit two together in the same color, what you notice is that it moves to the right. It's tilting to the right. Hold on a sec. There, can you see that better? So I've just worked a knit two together and it's leaning over to the right. But what you may not notice is that it is the leftmost stitch of the two that's on top. So that's important when we're doing color work. So knit two together leaves the leftmost stitch on top. So let's say I was going to do a knit two together of two different colors. It is the one on the left that will, here, I'm going to do that with the purple yarn. Boop. It's the one on the left. So if you want to continue a line of color and you're working two stitches together, then you want to knit two together if it's the leftmost stitch that you want prominent. And you want to SSK or slip one, knit one, pass the slip stitch over if you want the rightmost stitch to be prominent. Okay, so decreases in color work work a little bit differently. You're not worried so much about the lean as which stitch is on top. So knit two together, it's the leftmost stitch, and SSK or SPK, it's the rightmost stitch that's on top. And that works whether you're doing an SSSK or a knit three together as well. It's always the edge stitch that's going to be on top. If we do a centered double decrease, and you want a particular stitch on top, for example, you would want to, let's see, I'm going to back that up so I can do it in a two color spot. You would do the technique, it would be the center stitch for a centered double decrease. And so that's typically worked as slip two stitches, and I slip them purlwise, knit one. Is that right? Nope, sorry, slip two stitches knitwise. Not purlwise. So you're going to slip them as if to knit, slip them as if to knit, knit the third stitch. No, that's not right. Oh, isn't it great when the teacher doesn't remember how to do it? Slip both stitches knitwise. I'm sorry, I did it this time. And then you pass the two slip stitches over. And then the center stitch is the one on top. All right, I'm going to say it again because that was as clear as mud. You want to slip two stitches together knitwise, not one at a time. It's not like an SSK. I'm going to just repeat the whole thing. All right, these are over here. So you slip both stitches together knitwise, knit the third stitch and pass both stitches back over, and then the centered stitch is the one that stays on top. And it's raised. If you don't like it, if you don't like the look of the raised stitch, another way that you could do the same kind of decrease and have it be centered would be to do the decrease before. So you could do an SSK on this side and have, whoops, I got both yarns, have it leaning in, and then you could knit one, and then you could do the knit two together on the other side and have it lean in. So you have to play around a little bit with decrease. I am so sorry, that was right out of your sight. So you can do, this was the SSK before the center stitch. I knit the center stitch without decreasing it, and then I did a knit two together on the other side of it, on the left side of it. And so both of those purples lean in, and that one gray stitch stays in the center without being raised up. What about increases? Increases are more easily worked picking up either the float or the strand and doing a make one left or right. So if you want an increase in the purple, you would just pick up the float and do a make one right or a make one left with your purple yarn. If you wanted to make one with the gray there, the gray yarn is also in place right there. And you could make one left or right with the gray yarn. So that's a much easier and non-distorting way to make increases in the colorwork pattern. The other way that you can do increases or decreases is to do them in the plain one color rows. So if there are rows in between your pattern, that can be a good place for a series of increases or decreases that you might need in the shaping of your work. Any questions about that?
Do you
Okay.
need to worry about leaving so say you're going to be doing an increase, do you need to worry about making that float be a little bit looser because you're going to be making one out of it, or should it not pull?
I think overall, if you're tensioning your floats well, that little bit of extra twist isn't going to be a big deal. But if you know that you're going to be making an increase there, yes, you could try to make a longer float there.
Okay, but you don't have to worry about it too much.
No, that would be, I mean, certainly that would be a way of like reading your pattern ahead of time and circling an area or marking with, you know, I'm a big believer in copying your work from the book that it's in and then writing all over it as you're working on it, any little instruction or information that you need that's helpful to you. So for example, if you're really having trouble with long floats, and you want to use this technique of catching the floats in the subsequent round, then you need to just find those areas of long floats and make a little mark or a little symbol for yourself where that would get picked up in the next round. And you could just write that on your pattern, on your copy of your pattern. Okay. I want to demonstrate, oh, hello. I feel like that's a little bit glary. I want to demonstrate binding off in ferrule work or in stranded color work because you can shift your pattern over one stitch to the right. So for example, if I want my binding off to match, let's say I was doing a corrugated rib and I was knitting two or knitting one of one color and then switching, and I wanted my bind off to match that exactly, you would need to switch your colors one stitch to the right. And I just want to demonstrate that. So this is the color I want to bind off correctly. That means I need to knit the stitch to the right of it in the same color. So I'm going to knit it with gray. I'm going to knit with gray, and I'm going to bind off. So now that bind off is sitting over the gray stitch. I'm going to do another one with gray. It's sitting over the gray stitch, but this purple needs to be one stitch to the right for it to show up where it's going to be. So if I roll that up.
You're off camera.
Am I off camera? Sorry. Do you see how the gray is lined up on top of the gray here? And then the purple is lined up on top of the purple. And so if I switch my pattern one stitch over to the right, then the bind off stitches match the stitch below them. But if you don't do that, then the bind off stitches will match, will be one stitch over to the left. The colors will be one stitch over to the left. So when you're binding off in color, you need to move the colors over one stitch to the right. If you are working in the stickiest wools, for example, the Shetland wool, then you can use very minimal finishing techniques, and you can just trim the ends and they will felt to themselves. They'll just like if you use Icelandic wool or Shetland wool or any of the really sticky wools from the northern sheep, you can just trim the ends as you go to maybe an inch or two, and they will felt to themselves. You don't need to weave them in. It is, I talked to women in the Shetlands about this, and they were like, yeah, oh yeah, we just cut them and leave them, and then they never run. They never go anywhere because they're too sticky to run. It's amazing. If you're using anything else, you need to finish your ends as you would pretty much anything else, any other wool. So if it's not sticky enough, you need to weave in your ends at least a little bit. When you do a steek and you cut it and you have all of those ends, you can enclose that. You can pick up on both sides of the edge so that it's like encased to make a button band, and that will help keep them in. Another technique, if you're using more slick or slippery yarns, is to use a sewing machine and do a line of sewn stitches on a sewing machine on either side of your steek before you cut it, so that those stitches are reinforced. There's also a technique where you can take a crochet hook and crochet a line of stitches up on both sides of a steek to reinforce it. And then the last thing about stranded color work, and it's really important, is that if you do have any kind of bubbling or unevenness in the tensioning of your floats, the most important thing that you can do with that afterward is to block it. So stranded color work needs to be thoroughly saturated, so you might as well wash it while you're at it, and block it under tension. So that means getting the sweater or the garment completely saturated. I love that my dog is behind me licking my couch. Completely saturated, and then using your good techniques for blocking. So removing as much water as possible by letting it drain out, by pushing gently on the project in the basin, and then emptying as much water as possible out of the basin, and then squeezing it in a towel. So it's rolled up in a towel, and then you squeeze out as much water. I stand on mine to squeeze out water, and then I change the towel and I squeeze out more water, and then you lay it flat and pin it under tension. That will really guarantee that the floats, wool is a very stretchy material when it's wet. And so if there's issues with how your floats are, you can really repair that damage or that problem by blocking it under tension. And that is everything I wanted to tell you about stranded color work. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes.
Donna, what do you
just to back up a little bit, you know, when you were saying to make that increase, you could make it in the same color
Mhm.
before your pattern.
Mhm.
And then when you go into your pattern, is that going to mess up the alignment?
It really depends what you're doing next. So if you're making increases along the side of a neckline or along, it depends on what your color pattern is. You know, some stranded color work is not going to be a series of like zigzags. It's going to be something else. It's going to be a series of flowers, and you might be able to sneak in increases between the flowers, for example.
Oh, okay.
Or they can be incorporated into the patterning that's coming next. But if you're shaping knitting, for example, increases after the beginning of an armhole or decreases after the beginning of an armhole, or decreases for a V-neck, or increases or decreases for shaping along the side, those kinds of things can still be worked in stranded color work, but you need to just be aware what happens with the colors.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I have a sheet of notes that I have done for this class. This is it. It's everything that we've been talking about today. Christine is going to help me figure out how to make that downloadable. We have it for each of our classes. We have the, you know, the curriculum notes that we work from. And we're going to be looking at how to put that on our website so that you can download and look at the notes or have the notes available to you.
Good.
Also, this will be on the website on the calendar page and on the Zooms page. We've now added a section for video recordings.
Okay.
Any other questions?